I wonder if you can take us back 15 million years ago and talk to us about our evolutionary journey to where we are at the moment.
Sure.
In a couple of minutes.
In a couple of minutes. Yeah, I can't take 15 million years. No. Real trigger for the whole process was uric acid elevation as a downstream metabolite of fructose consumption, consuming those wild berries that primates consume in preparation for hibernation. That signaling pathway to make us fatter was adaptive and led to our survival. Now we have our foot on the accelerator of that pathway 365 days a year, preparing by storing and making fat for a time of scarcity that we will not experience. People seem to fail to realize, and we're here visiting and staying at a hotel, and you have breakfast, and the first thing you want to do is pour that 12-ounce glass of orange juice. That's not natural. I don't care who made it. It didn't come from nature. The oranges were harvested, squeezed, put in a carton, on and on. And we would not normally, as hunter-gatherers, gather up cartons of orange juice and then drink that huge exposure of 36 grams of sugar in a 12-ounce glass of orange juice or apple juice. Overwhelms our small intestine's ability to deal with the fructose load, which is about 5 grams at a time.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
David, thanks so much for taking the time to jump on the board.
I'm delighted to see you and spend time with you.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this. You won't remember this, but when I was working in A&E in Australia back in 2014, I flew all the way from Sydney to Florida to watch you at a conference. I said hi to both you and your wife actually at the time, but you won't remember, but I shook your hand and I remember going to that conference actually, and you're one of the star speakers as you are everywhere. And you really did change my opinion on many things.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's hopefully a good thing.
A very good thing, really good thing. And I just, you were a real sort of change point in the way I thought about medicine and how I kind of moved from conventional medicine to include nutritional medicine and all the other things that you talk about.
And that brings up a really good point of, the notion of alternative medicine means one or the alternative, the other, as opposed to integrating ideas from the best of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, conferences like the ones that we attend now is a lot more inclusive. And I think a lot of clinicians who perhaps are a bit more skeptical are coming around to the idea because people like yourself who are bona fide in their respective specialties are really pushing the boundaries and getting the message out.
And I think some of it also is consumer driven. I think that physicians are feeling the pressure to delineate themselves in the marketplace with some degree of uniqueness. And I think the public is demanding that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was wondering where to start this conversation, but I
thought we already started.
No. We are started. We're started. But I managed to catch a little bit of your talk earlier today, where you talked about 15 million years ago, how we've evolved and what kind of elements in our biology we have and have sort of adapted and why that's so essential for survival. I wonder if you can take us back 15 million years ago and talk to us about our evolutionary journey to where we are at the moment.
Sure.
In a couple of minutes.
In a couple of minutes. Yeah, I can't take 15 million years.
No.
Around 15 million years ago, we were in what's called the Middle Miocene period. And it was a time when over about 1 million years, the Earth cooled. And as such, food for our primate ancestors became less and less available. So it was a selection pressure genetically to determine who would survive and who would not. And a group of primates had a little bit of an advantage whereby they were able to be more thrifty with the foods that they consumed, make more fat, and therefore had basically a superpower that cultivated their survival, because they could get through times of food scarcity by virtue of the fact that they laid down a little bit more fat, not that they became obese, but they would have an advantage over the next primate because he or she did not have that ability. And now it turns out that we understand what that change was. We have the ability to retroactively look at genetics of our ancestors by looking at current day primates. And what the change was a change in the gene suite that codes for an enzyme called uricase. That enzyme breaks down uric acid. And as such, a reduction of that gene functionality led to less uricase, less breakdown of uric acid. So over 1 million years, their uric acid levels climbed. Now, for people who are thinking about uric acid and gout, all well and good, but it's the uric acid in the context of giving them that advantage, that extra fat, increasing their blood sugar, increasing their blood pressure, that while not dramatic, was enough to keep them alive and become our ancestors, such that we as humans also have a uricase deficiency and have higher uric acid levels. As such, our bodies are very thrifty and want to store away every precious calorie that we consume for the upcoming winter that obviously never evolves.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned a couple of things there. Increasing in body fat, increases in blood pressure, increases in blood sugar. Right. Most people listening to this podcast will think of those things as a bad thing. Right. But as you've quite eloquently pointed out,
it's absolutely contextual.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. In the context of our ancestors, it would be a home run to be insulin resistant, to have higher blood sugar, to make and store fat and have higher blood pressure. Those would be advantages as it relates to your ability to survive. Nowadays, of course, we do everything we possibly can not to have those characteristics in our physiology. And therefore, now that we understand this relationship to uric acid, we understand how powerful a tool that becomes for us in helping reduce those very metabolic issues that we need to gain control over.
Yeah. So let's paint that environmental picture a little bit clearer for the listeners here. So back thousands of years ago, when we have these deficiencies that enable us to have those protective mechanisms, what kind of environment are we living in? What kind of hostilities are we dealing with? Those actually become an adaptive role.
Well, the real trigger for the whole process was uric acid elevation as a downstream metabolite of fructose consumption, consuming those wild berries that our ancestors would come upon, that primates consume in preparation for hibernation. In preparation for winter, that bears consume in preparation for hibernation. So that signaling pathway to make us fatter was adaptive and led to our survival. Now we have our foot on the accelerator of that pathway 365 days a year, preparing by storing and making fat for a time of scarcity that we will not experience. So that fat lipogenesis process is totally in overdrive. That process by which our bodies think it needs to make more blood sugar is in overdrive. And when we see the expansive rise of obesity, overweight, and diabetes globally, now we have a real good understanding as to why it's happening.
Yeah. So it seems to me like we're utilizing ancient hardware, our bodies essentially, when we're putting it into a new context right now where we have availability of nutrients all the time. We have a dense calorie diet across all different countries. We have an abundance of sugar whenever we want. And obviously we're hardwired to want that sugar as well. So how do we adapt our ancient hardware for the modern environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, it's the central theme of Drop Acid, that we are being served to the detriment by this mismatch between our evolution and therefore our genome and our current physiology and the current environment in which we live. They're not lining up, and it explains the manifestations that I just delineated of the metabolic issues that are so pervasive globally today. So how do we do that? Well, what we do is we bring the adult back in the room. Many of us people around the world are functioning more from a more primitive brain center, the amygdala, and making decisions without any concern for consequence. What might this decision impart on me health-wise tomorrow or next year? How might this decision not just affect me, but you or other people? We need to bring the prefrontal cortex back into the game and say, take a step back, that maybe you really want the cupcake or donut right now. We all do.
Yeah.
There's nobody that goes by the donut factory and says, yeah, I really don't want that. We all do. But the adult in the room says, if you do that, then you're going to increase your risk for serious illness that may not be curable. And when we are able to embrace that, to take that deep breath and maybe count to 10, whatever it may be, to pull the impulsivity away from the decision-making, it gives us the ability to really act with our superpower, our brain with such a large prefrontal cortex that allows us to integrate so many inputs of our cognitive function into the ultimate outcome.
Yeah. It reminds me of the marshmallow test. I only came across this a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure you're well aware of it. Yeah. So for the listener, the ability to delay gratification appears to be a cognitive task that we need to really exercise a lot more on. And particularly, it seems particularly relevant for this as well, as we're always going past donut factories.
Right. I mean, everywhere. I mean, I walk down the streets of London and it's cakes here, cakes there.
Yeah.
Your sweets, and you deserve them because you're good.
Yeah.
I mean, we grew up with that mentality. If you're good, you'll get, you'll get the sweet dessert.
Yeah.
We call children when they behave, you're acting sweet.
Yeah.
And what do you get on your birthday? You bombard your physiology with sugar. Doesn't do you any good.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into uric acid a little bit more. So most people, like you said at the start, think about uric acid in the context of gout. We think about it in the context of the painful toe and allopurinol and colchicine, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories we use for that inflammation. We don't really think about it in the context of all the other drivers towards excess uric acid. And I think a lot of people listening to this will probably not make the connection, and I'll have to explain it in the title of this podcast. But let's talk about uric acid as...
So let's take it back to where you and I first learned about uric acid.
Yeah.
We had a 15-minute lecture that said if your uric acid levels are high, you might get gout. And if you get gout, then you're going to take a drug. Let's move on. And that's how, even to this day, patients are treated. They come in with a gouty, painful toe, and they'll get put on their uric acid and perhaps colchicine acutely. And next patient, please. Out they go, out the door. Well, this is not your grandfather's uric acid. This is a uric acid that, as wonderfully characterized by a study appearing in 2016 that was entitled Uric Acid in the Metabolic Syndrome, from innocent bystander to a central player. I mean, it doesn't happen just to be elevated in obesity and diabetes and hypertension and hypertriglyceridemia. It is playing a functional, central, mechanistic role in causing these problems. For you and me, that's empowering because it's a very new and powerful tool, addition to our toolbox, our armamentarium, if you will, that allows us to help people regain metabolic health.
And so when looking at uric acid, how does it relate to all those other areas that we're not currently talking about? So you mentioned obesity, cardiovascular disease. What's the connection there? What's driving?
Well, Rupi, when we look at epidemiologic research, first of all, that shows relationships. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate causality, so it's a correlative type of pursuit. We see very strong correlations, and we've known this for quite some time with everything you just mentioned. So again, interesting that we see elevated uric acid in correlation with hypertension, diabetes, obesity, etc. But mechanistically now we've unraveled how it is that uric acid does its dirty work. And there are multiple mechanisms that it utilizes in an attempt to keep us heavier and higher blood sugar and higher blood pressure. Why? Because those were survival mechanisms. So they're very, very preserved, very powerful, and they're self-regenerative, meaning once they get triggered, they tend to keep going. So how many mechanisms are there? Countless. One of the more recently identified mechanisms is the recognition that uric acid powerfully inhibits the production and functionality of nitric oxide. Now, why is that relevant? Because nitric oxide does two important things in the human body, aside from serving as a neurotransmitter. Nitric oxide allows blood vessels to relax. So without its functionality, because uric acid's elevated, blood vessels can't open up, hypertension, and poor blood supply to our organs. might explain why people with high uric acid have about a 35% increased risk of ischemic stroke, a 40% increased risk of dying from a cardiovascular event. Because nitric oxide is compromised, blood vessels can't do what they need to do. The other issue with nitric oxide is it directly and significantly compromises both the production of how insulin works and in terms of insulin getting out of the blood vessel into the cell or to the cell membrane, and then the actual functionality of insulin once it binds to the cell membrane. So what I just said is that nitric oxide is needed for insulin sensitivity. Uric acid compromises nitric oxide and as such compromises insulin sensitivity and therefore contributes to insulin resistance. As a wonderful survival mechanism that you don't need, that I don't need, when we have insulin resistance, it paves the way for type 2 diabetes and all of the downstream issues related to that. And as a momentary digression, recognize that becoming a type 2 diabetic may as much as quadruple your risk for an untreatable disease called Alzheimer's. So these are very real, important discussions. Every endpoint we can leverage to help people balance their blood sugar has incredibly widespread implications, not just for the brain, but for the heart and for the immune system, and even as it relates to cancer risk.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the brain because I wanted to bring it closer to home for you as well in terms of how uric acid can impact Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. Are there any other links in that way, or is it mainly via insulin resistance that you have that impact on the negative impact on the brain?
It's mainly via insulin resistance. We know that there are some important parts of the brain that are, in fact, though this is relatively new information, do in fact require insulin for those neurons to be able to utilize glucose as a fuel source. We know that various areas of the brain can alternatively function in terms of their energetic requirement with using ketones as substrate. And while we talk about that and interventional trials whereby people with early Alzheimer's and even mid-stage Alzheimer's have been benefited by a ketogenic approach, by and large, if we can preserve those neurons' ability to utilize glucose, it's going to happen far earlier in the clinical course, even in the preclinical stage. In other words, when people are still cognitively intact. So that becomes a very, very big issue. But let me just expand that a little bit more if I can. We haven't had the opportunity to talk about this even at this conference. Sure. When glucose is elevated, as it is in the Alzheimer's brain, as much as 5-fold in various parts of the brain, that right off the bat is a big surprise. That's kind of recent news that we're thinking, well, the brain is glucose depleted and therefore neurons are starving because they don't have glucose to utilize. No, as a matter of fact, it's not that there's not a lot of fuel around in terms of glucose. It's there, but the purveyance of that glucose to the cell and the utilization is where the compromise is. So this has become what is now known as the bioenergetic theory of Alzheimer's, which works in concert with various other inputs to realize the disease that is given that name. But that said, consider it the law of mass action, if you will. Higher levels of glucose stimulate a pathway called the polyol pathway, whereby glucose is transformed, intermediate is sorbitol, but ultimately into fructose. Now we're back to our fructose conversation. So you're not eating, or you may be, but if you're not eating fructose, you think you're in the clear. If your brain glucose level is now elevated, you are going to produce within the brain higher levels of fructose and produce within the brain uric acid. And think about that. Higher levels of uric acid has as its downstream consequence two very important players related to brain health and risk for disease: inflammation and oxidative stress. We've characterized the Alzheimer's brain as being the brain on fire, a brain in which even visualization of inflammatory activity is now possible. So it's a brain that is literally on fire. It's a brain in which various enzymatic pathways are compromised by oxidative stress. And further, it's a brain that is energetically struggling because it is ultimately an acquired mitochondriopathy. The mitochondria within each neuron, and each neuron can have 1,000 or more mitochondria, are trying to make energy for those brain cells. They are damaged by uric acid. So that's a powerful relationship then between, understanding that glucose in the brain is elevated, ultimately getting to oxidative stress and inflammation in the brain that is really a very powerfully damaging effect on the mitochondria. Now, when the mitochondria are dysfunctional, cannot produce energy, that triggers within the brain cell the pathway called apoptosis, the suicide pathway. So now we've connected production of fructose in the brain to uric acid, to oxidative stress, damaging the mitochondria, to cell suicide and dropout, loss of brain cells as a consequence of this entire paradigm. And that explains a lot of stuff, a lot of things that were kind of hanging in the ether there for a lot, many of us who were involved in research for an awful long time.
Yeah. And it sounds, to draw a very crude analogy between the brain swimming in glucose but not being able to utilize it and there being mitochondriopathy. So it's almost like in type 1 diabetes, where you have enough glucose in your blood system, in your bloodstream, but the inability to put that glucose in the right places and partition it, the fuel correctly. So I understand that. And I think the inflammation piece brings me nicely onto the other bit about uric acid levels and how that can negatively impact the gut as well. I wonder if you could talk a bit about uric acid and its
Sure.
impact
So much is talked about it as it relates to inflammation. You've written about it in your books, and uric acid directly leads to inflammation as one of the very big issues. Inhibits nitric oxide, increases reactive oxidative stress, leads to insulin resistance. Many of the downstream effects of having elevated uric acid are, directly contributory ultimately to metabolic dysfunction, and therefore the whole panorama of chronic degenerative conditions well beyond the brain. But as it relates to the gut, uric acid directly changes the array and functionality of our gut bacteria. It directly enhances the leakiness of the gut and therefore contributes to increased inflammation by virtue of how that leakiness allows certain things to get out of the gut into systemic circulation and augment inflammation like LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It's also been interestingly noted that a treatment for gout, you're going to love this, that is very effective in reducing frequency of gout flare-ups is fecal microbial transplant. Putting back into the gut of an individual with gout different bacteria, fecal material, from a person without gout. So there are a multitude of mechanisms here, and it's all being unraveled now, and it's very, very exciting.
Wow. I can't imagine what that patient would have questioned when being presented with gout and then being offered an FMT.
It all depends how you present it. I mean, over the years, I've broached the topic to patients about will you consider undergoing an FMT?
Yeah.
And I, across the board, never had a pushback.
Really? Oh, interesting.
I mean, even for a mother considering it as a way to help her autistic child, and watching as that child regain his ability to speak, a woman who is profoundly compromised by just an overexposure to antibiotics and just regained her life, not just with a fecal microbial transplant that she did at home using her neighbor's fecal material, but also by revamping her diet as well. I mean, gosh, she ended up on television in the States talking about this. And, I get that it's distasteful and it's challenging, but there's a lot of research being done using FMT. Wonderful interventional trial was conducted at the University of Arizona, collaborative study with Harvard researchers. Dr. Alessio Fasano, I think, participated in that study, showing dramatic improvements in not only the gastrointestinal issues related to autism, but also the neurocognitive functionality as well. So we're just beginning to get our arms around what the potential can be.
Yeah, I remember actually you bring up a few case studies back in 2015, I believe it was, when I saw you speak, with parents who had autistic children and they'd have the FMT and they had some pretty drastic results. Small numbers, but still impressive enough, to warrant further investigation. Looking at...
Let me finish that thought.
Yeah.
Not that this is necessarily the end-all home run, but it's another piece of the puzzle. We need to think about it, not only in terms of that therapy, that intervention in particular, but the implications about what it means that these kids have a messed up array of bacteria, and how did they get there in the first place? So one thing we know is that the risk of autism is dramatically increased in children born by C-section, where they don't have this anointment of going through the vaginal birth canal and being exposed to vaginal bacteria. So, what does that mean we should consider? We should consider, having a more expansive conversation with mother and husband about your mode of delivery, more than just, well, how long will I be in the hospital and what will my scar look like if I elect to have a C-section? Sure, a C-section is a life-saving technique. We get that. But it is, sometimes, I dare to say, an issue of convenience.
Yeah. And I think it's those conversations that we're not having as much in traditionally practicing doctors and clinicians, and after chatting to a lot of people here and over the last couple of years, it feels like giving everyone a level playing field, optimizing their gut microbiota, optimizing someone's diet, optimizing someone's psychological environment as well, can essentially create the sort of level playing field where health can flourish as a sort of salutogenic approach, if you like.
True. But by and large, the provision of healthcare globally doesn't do what you just said, isn't designed to allow health to flourish. It's designed to combat disease. So, it's a far more feminine approach. You've been inside the lecture hall, that most of the people here are women. And it's because, my sense is that their approach to life is based on femininity. It's more about nurturing as opposed to combating this or that, in this case, illness.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I'm definitely going to pay more attention to that because you're right. Every conference I've been to, it's largely dominated by, and a lot of people who follow my work and buy the books as well are certainly women. Looking at uric-acid a little bit more broadly now, with the kind of diets that we've talked about traditionally when trying to reduce one's uric acid level, usually in the hope that their gout gets better or we can optimize with allopurinol, it's usually a low purine diet.
Right.
A lot of foods are purine in as well, but I heard you talk about actually, from what we just talked about now, with fructose being one of the main reasons as to why you might have a high uric acid level, we're looking at the wrong culprit.
That's right. And it's been looked at for an awful long time.
Uh-huh.
And by and large, the messaging about uric acid is in the context of gout. And it's sort of like, is there anything else you could do beyond taking the drug? In my world, is there anything else you can do before taking the drug? And by and large, as you correctly characterized, it is about limiting your purines. I mean, gout was considered the king of diseases and the disease of kings. And it was thought that because they had such high purines in their diets, that the various meats and animal products they would consume, that led the way to gout. Reality is that gout didn't really begin, except for the past couple of hundred years, in humans anyway, and did parallel the introduction of sugar into our diets, which began in 1600s to a significant degree. Yes, purines are involved, but much less so overall. It's the sugar, and specifically it's the fructose. And mind you, a table sugar, sucrose, is 50% fructose, so that's a powerful exposure to fructose as well. But it's challenging that the fructose messaging doesn't make its way to the very popular mainstream clinic websites who say, yes, you've got to limit your purines. Matter of fact, you don't to some degree. There are a lot of foods that have fairly high levels of purines, like cruciferous vegetables, I might add. Yeah. And we don't want to limit those. If you look at the NHANES food frequency questionnaire studies involving tens of thousands of people, they demonstrate that people with the highest consumption of high purine cruciferous vegetables, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, etc., have the lowest uric acid. Same thing with fruit. So are there high levels of purines in organ meats and in small fish? There are. But most people, I think, are best served by first targeting their fructose. That's the best bang for the buck.
Yeah, and the culprits, as I'm sure everyone listening to this will recognize: sugar-sweetened beverages, processed foods, donuts,
orange juice, apple juice.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, people seem to fail to realize, and we're here visiting and staying at a hotel, and you have breakfast, and the first thing you want to do is pour that, 12-ounce glass of orange juice. That's not natural. I don't care who made it. It didn't come from nature. The oranges were harvested, squeezed, put in a carton, on, and we would not normally, as hunter-gatherers, gather up cartons of orange juice and then drink that huge exposure of 36 grams of sugar in a 12-ounce glass of orange juice or apple juice overwhelms our small intestine's ability to deal with the fructose load, which is about 5 grams at a time. So that overload of fructose is then processed in the liver and then sets the stage for increasing our blood sugar, increasing our lipid fat production, activating the production of uric acid and all of those downstream issues that we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I always ask people to just imagine how many oranges or how many apples are utilized to create that small glass of juice that you're about to consume.
That's right. In the absence then of fiber and the bioflavonoids to some degree, if it's been treated, and certainly vitamin C. Yeah. So it's not a natural experience to bombard your body with that much sugar at a time. It overwhelms us, basically, and it sends a powerful signal to your body: prepare for winter.
Yes, exactly, which is leading to the obesogenic effects and everything. We talked a bit about the foods to sort of take out of the diet. What are the things that we want to include into the diet that can be uric acid?
Well, foods like red onion, for example, asparagus, artichoke, various vegetables are high in various types of what are called bioflavonoids that actually help us reduce our production of uric acid. They work by inhibiting the same enzyme that the drug does, allopurinol. The enzyme is called xanthine oxidase. So drugs that are high in these bioflavonoids, like luteolin and quercetin, tart cherries, for example, are long recognized as being associated with lowered uric acid. So we can eat those foods and we can take those active ingredients, if you will, quercetin, luteolin, et cetera, as supplements and really go a long way to help us lower our uric acid.
Yeah. Talking a bit in the context of our body having ancient hardware and putting ourselves in a modern environment, we also would have been exposed to changes in weather, changes in food availability, things that we don't have to deal with right now. I mean, we're sat here in an air-conditioned room whilst it's like 33 degrees outside. We had 33 degrees centigrade outside. Right. We have an abundance of foods flown in from all around the world. If I want a cherry today, I can also have a cherry in December. We're exposed to sort of this flat of comfort. Everything is very comfort orientated. So how do we actually push our body to experience some of those hormetic effects?
Great question. There's a book that I just finished reading called The Crisis of Comfort by Michael Easter. And he writes about the fact that we need, and the book goes through everything you've talked about but interspersed with his experience of being, I think, 30 days in Alaska, having to hunt animals and really being challenged.
Yeah.
But that said, there is significant health upside to being uncomfortable and to experience these challenges to the extent that it is stressful to us from a thermal perspective, hot or cold, from a caloric restrictive perspective, being starved, if you will, or calorie restricted. from overdoing it with respect to exercise from time to time. And you use the term hormetic effect, of course, so that it's a lot like lifting weights. When you lift weights, you tear down a little bit of muscle fiber, then you build it back to where it was, and then a little bit more. So you end up net positive. That's how you build muscle. And so it is with hormesis, that we experience the stress, we deal with the stress, we get pushed back a little bit, one step backwards, and end up taking two steps forward, and we become better for the event.
Yeah. This adaptive mechanism,
That's
I think,
right.
is fascinating. And in the context of how we should be challenged at various points, we can definitely do things like exercise. We can eat bioflavonoid-rich foods that have that hormetic effect at a cellular level. But what about the patterns of eating that we're accustomed to across a 12-month period? So is there a rationale for having a different macronutrient composition in the winter versus spring versus summer? Should we introduce like a ketogenic diet at certain times and then a more carbohydrate-rich diet at other times?
I would say by and large, no. That may be a surprising answer for you. And the reason being is that we don't have to adapt anymore for the change of seasons because our environment is totally controlled. We have clothing that keeps us warm. We have our homes that are heated to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 365, so that the notion of trying to eat foods in season, while that is ideal, when we are going to be confronted by seasonality, makes sense. I think it's less relevant today.
Yeah. And since writing, your first books that are widely popular, influence a lot of people, are there things that you've changed your opinion on, or you've sort of progressed on or built on top of?
Indeed. And I will tell you that that doesn't go unchallenged. People say, oh, Dr. Perlmutter, when you wrote Life Guide, a book I wrote many, many years ago, you told us we should be on a low-fat diet. That was, 25 years ago? And that was a mentality at the time based on currently available science. So messaging should change over time. And I think that it's important for people who follow, dare I say, influencers, to recognize that you want them to be adaptive and flexible and be able to admit that things are different now. I'd say mostly a bigger change in our diet has been more plant-based for a variety of reasons, though we're not fully plant-based, that's for sure. I think over the years, the science on the value of exercise has become much more well-defined. So that has become much more, plus I'm older, and so it becomes much more important anyway. So that's become a much more central part of the messaging. The value of sleep has become much more central as well. But I would simply say that things are going to change. I mean, the whole uric acid paradigm is relatively new, despite the fact that the first book talking about uric acid outside of the constraints of gout and kidney stones was written in 1898.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's right.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, and I think it gives you a lot more respect, I think, the fact that you're willing to change your opinion on things from the low-fat era to the era now. What do you make of the higher fat, the ketogenic sort of modes of eating? Is that something that you encourage, or does it really depend on the context of the patient? Do you see it as a therapeutic tool or
there's no
tool?
question that a ketogenic diet can be therapeutic in my world as it relates to both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So that research is very compelling. My sense is that as far as the population at large is concerned, to get into from time to time a state of ketosis, I think is reasonable to keep that mechanism active and available as having a flexible physiology. I don't think that remaining in ketosis full on all the time is necessarily the goal. And I think most of the advocates of ketogenic diet would probably agree with that cycling back and forth is the way to remain most adaptive and flexible.
Yeah. I think certainly periods of going into and out of can be useful, particularly given the clinical context. And also just generally changing one's diet from time to time. We had Walter Longo on the podcast a year and a bit ago, and more recently as well. And I think that concept of stressing your body from time to time is going to become necessary, particularly as we're quite comfortable with.
That's right. I spoke to him yesterday, oddly enough, about these topics. And I think it's a job in process, a work in process. I think we don't yet know, but I think one dictum that remains central, and that is, the work of Dr. Lauren Cordain in the 60s, that we really need to consider emulating as best we can the environment of our ancestors and trying as best we can to reestablish this relationship, cultivate a relationship between our environment and our genome, our environment and our evolution, the gift that we've received. And we can't. I mean, we can't go out and be hunter-gatherers anymore. But that said, we should look upon our current environment in terms of how it deviates most aggressively from that of our ancestors, and really address those factors. Whether it means more stress by getting out of doors more and being in a less controlled environment, certainly limiting our exposure to fructose and other things that have entered into the modern diet. These are not hard to accomplish.
Yeah. Do you fast at all?
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
We fast, yeah. In fact, we did last year our social media fast, and we had
nice.
I think we had 10,000 people fasting together.
Fab.
Oh, it was
amazing.
wonderful. We had I forget what you call it. There's a special name for when everybody gets together and does something online. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, brilliant. And was that social media fast, or was that like an FMD thing?
Oh, I get where you're going.
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
it was a food. It was not eating for.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
But it was done on social media.
Yeah,
but fasting from social media makes sense to me as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask actually as we bring this conversation to a close. I mean, you've been a pioneer in a lot of communities. I mean, over here, you're very well known as well. You must have got a lot of backlash over the last couple of decades of publishing books and everything.
Thank goodness.
Criticism.
You bet.
Yeah. How do you deal with that?
I'm supported by that. Yeah. I mean, when I stop getting pushback, I'm status quo. And Ronald Reagan, one of our presidents, once said that status quo is a Latin term for the mess we're in. So I think it's good to challenge whatever we see around us, right or wrong. I've been wrong about things that we have been in favor of for at times. And Thomas Edison said that he learned more from his 99 failures than he did from the one success. So people say, well, what you're doing is outside the box. That's not the goal. The goal is to make the box bigger, to really augment inclusivity with ideas that seem fringe. Because ultimately, people say, oh, it becomes self-evident that we knew it all the time. Well, not so much, but the whole idea with uric acid, we're right at the beginning of that whole incorporation of uric acid into our understanding of what leads to metabolic dysfunction. And I suspect that in 2 years, when we get together on a podcast again, or whenever that may be, we will be appreciative of a much more expansive understanding of the role of uric acid in metabolism.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. Well, I love that growth mindset. That's brilliant. As we bring this to a close now, any mental health tips? Like, how do you look after your mental well-being on a day-to-day, particularly when you're traveling and moving around so much?
Well, I have a wonderful marriage, first of all. And that, more than anything, I think has kept me in a great place. Beyond that, I think exercise is important. Dedicating to sleep, with travel especially, limiting to almost no alcohol during the travel part, I think is really very important. And what I really try to do more so lately is to do one thing at a time. Have a conversation with you right now. Have a meal at a given time, not be checking text messages. It's so tempting. I want to look something up, ask Siri something because I really want to know who starred in that movie because it's part of a conversation, but not to do it, to be dedicated to the moment, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful advice. I'm getting married this year, so hopefully, I've taken your advice already. I'm sure I have. She doesn't listen to the podcast anyway, so it's fine.
Well, I would say also now that I know you, good for her as well to marry you.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for
My
coming
pleasure.
on.
Thank you
It was
for
an
having me.
absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed that video, you will love the library of content that we have on doctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.